And joining us today from Verbier in Switzerland, very, very close to me, where I live. We didn't do this in person for some reason, but time restraints. But I think we're going to do one of these again because it's such an interesting subject. Kelly and I are going to talk about UFOs. Um, Slightly, I don't know, would you say a controversial subject? But um, we've had a long chats in the past, in the last few months, about what we're going to talk about today. It's very, very interesting. And so Kelly is a former investment banker and has always been a venture capitalist. So Kelly, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Nico.
Yeah, good. So maybe you give us because I think it's important to establish your 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 background, that you're not some crackpot UFO guy. It's actually, you're a solid citizen, well educated, very financially very successful in your life, and you're coming towards the end, as you say, the twilight of your life, which you said to me yesterday, which I not yet, Kelly, you're still too young.
Okay.
But it's such an interesting subject for me, and I think we're going to have a really good time on this one. So, what is your background, and then we'll just take it from there, Kelly.
Well, I'm a former Swiss investment banker, and I had an experience that led me back to school just for the love of learning and to understand that experience I had. I wanted to understand it was what I called a mystical experience at the time, but it just those were the days of the modems with the squeaky sounds, and the best description I could have was that a whole encyclopedia of information was uploading in my experience, and my cognitive abilities were just unable to process all of the information. It was the emotional information was so intense, so wonderful, so beautiful that I could just, it took me time, and I had to leave the banking industry and to go back and to study. When I studied the patristics, Christian church fathers, and then I undertook doctoral research to develop new theory in psychology. So I studied all the innovators and the pioneers in that field, and came up with a book finally many years later, um, on developing a concept of what the next Reformation might look like. And that's basically where I'm at now. I felt I had to intervene on the subject of UAPs, which I had an experience much earlier in life when I was just coming out of high school. And that was, of course, considered very fringe in those days. My family didn't understand what was going on. That didn't matter. I have a long history, and that'll be part of the subject of the book I'm writing.
Mm. So, like I said, we had long chats. I think I came around I was expecting to do about an hour to chat about doing a podcast, and I think we spoke for about 2 hours straight. It was such an interesting subject, but you really piqued my interest a couple of times with a couple of little throwaway lines you threw in there about how you spent time with an alien contactee when in Italy and went to live with that particular person. So that was very interesting. I would like to talk about that for just for a moment, and also that you also mentioned that your mother, organized a UFO. I'm going to call it a UFO conference. You can correct me. In back in the 70s. So you've been exposed to this for a long time.
Yes, I have, but I would not say I was always exposed to it consciously. Uh, it became much clearer what was going on when during the unconscious moments after that mystical experience. All of it started to unfold when I started searching uh, and doing academic search. But academic, I would say, it's also a personal search. And I had the luxury and the financial independence to be able to do that.
Mhm. So I, you haven't really told me the story about how you met this contactee, but I would just like to know what this person experienced. This Italian gentleman. What was his experience, and how did that affect that person? How did that affect his personality, his worldview, etc.?
Well, maybe I should answer your first question about my
Oh yeah,
mother. Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah, my mother organized a meeting, just right when I was graduating from high school on UFOs. Um, Rather strange thing for me because she never spoke about her interest in the subject. I did find a book by a contactee by George Adamski in her library that was signed, but strangely, of course, she never really talked to us about the subject. And she came up with this conference of UFOs, and my cousins in California, they had seen things. I had always had a strong fascination on the subject that I couldn't understand why, because I even in those days I felt I was not belonging in the right family, so I had this transcendent interest that I didn't understand. I didn't have a Christian upbringing, and so I didn't need to see a UFO conference. Anyway, she attended it, and that's when these ufologists giving pictures and a presentation said there's UFO contactee Eugenio Siragusa. That's the Italian pronunciation. Eugenio Siragusa with the American accent was coming to Geneva to give a conference, and I said, "Oh, that should be interesting." So that's what I went to attend that. And a very strange thing to answer your question about my mother, she revealed something that she had never spoken about. She said when she was pregnant with me, she saw an alien. I mean, she saw one just looking at her in her bed, and that was it. And you have to understand my mother. She's kind of a socialite, and all over the place, and I never really took it that seriously, because it's just the way, you know. But it's something that, of course, would mark me later when I reflected on things she said. Anyway, I this fellow in Sicily basically claimed to have an experience near a bus stop that some kind of beam, hit him, and he was trying to process what happened to him. And later, he would claim that he had an encounter on the flanks of the Etna, Mount Etna in Sicily. And when I saw him in Geneva, he invited me to join him because, of course, I spoke fluent Italian because of my family history. Americans moved to Milan and divorced, and mother moved to Geneva. So I grew up in Geneva. So it's just circumstances that enabled me to speak three languages since I was basically a toddler. So I spoke fluent Italian, and of course, he invited me to see him, and we developed a relationship. And instead of going to university, I joined him for 4 years. So does that answer your question?
yeah. It does, yeah. But it's going to bring us on to the fact. But I just thought of another thing. So you said you had a mystical experience later in life that maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but yeah, this mystical experience later in life, and then you started to put these pieces together, as part of your own personal story, and your mother telling you that she had an encounter with a being when she was pregnant with you. So that's usually one of the questions I ask when I speak to people who have had mystical experiences, whether any of their relatives, usually a parent, has had them too. So was that a surprise to you that you subsequently did have your own mystical experience?
Um, well, you have to understand some of the um, quite extraordinary background in my history. It's not your usual track that people normally follow. So, what led to my decisions? So, I stayed with that person for 4 years, and there's a reason why I was drawn to him. I mean, there was something you could say, of course, charismatic about the character. He had this transcendent way about him, and remember, I had no no religious upbringing, really. I mean, other than a social, my mother sings in the choir sometimes and that kind of thing. But I had this hunger for depth, and I didn't understand where it came from. I had a very strong moral compass. I didn't know where it came from. So I was the black sheep, basically, in the family, because I would always make moral judgments as a kid. Scripture says the truth comes out of the mouths of babes. I couldn't help it. What's going on? Bang, don't, growing up in a very narcissistic family, when I didn't necessarily have that impetus as my primary motivation, gets me in a little bit of trouble, which I didn't understand at the time. Of course, I understood these things progressively through a lot of pain, unfelt pain. So that's also part of the book I'm writing, because I want to help people how these things can happen so other people can identify things that I struggle so long to understand, because the world doesn't encourage such kind of understanding.
Yeah. So now we're getting into the meat of it. And so what we discussed before, and we're going to talk a lot more about this, but in a nutshell, based on your studies and your experiences in life, later on in life, we're talking about UAPs and for contactees who have had experiences with these beings. We call them aliens, whatever you want to call them. What do you refer to them as?
Well, the word du jour is non-human intelligence.
Non-human intelligence. That's it. That's the word I was looking for. The phrase. Yeah. But you've got a very different take on it, and that's what I really want to get into. So, you also described yourself as and I might get this wrong, but a theistic psychologist. Did I get that right?
No, it's because of all the studies I've done. There is no real discipline that defines the areas of focus and specialization. I would say specialization is a strong word. I'm an integrative type of person, so I'm not so specialized. I bring things together, but the way the mind is designed to think. So I would call them a theoanthropologist and a theopsychologist, because they work together. And there's no such disciplines. I mean, you can't go to a seminary for that. You can't go to a secular university for that kind of a degree. But it reflects the approach the church fathers had, in how they practiced Christianity. It was so much more psychological. St. Augustine, articulated the unconscious becoming conscious long before Freud even came up with it. Freud was a result of that loss of Christian psychology that was practiced in the early church, which you get authors like C.S. Lewis, who try to bring that back into stories and narratives, a lot for children, to understand the psychology of the relationship, which is one of the reasons why he was so popular, because he addresses a bit that area which modern Christianity has lost. You have a preacher who gives a monologue, but a monologue is not personal. The personal happens in the dialogue, like we're having today. We're sharing our personal experiences. It's contagious or can affect each other and help us grow in understanding.
Mm. So when you talk about the early church, we're talking about pre-established religion.
Well, usually the dividing line is with Saint Bernard, who's called the last of the church fathers. You have the arrival of the first appearance of scholasticism, where the faith became practiced in the head, the cognitive, because you get the Pharisees, Jesus speaks to the Pharisees. He says, first clean the inside of the cup, then the outside of the cup will be clean. He says, get your motivations, the lust of your flesh, which is the narcissistic motivations, versus the desires of the spirit. Get your heart clean. Focus on the desires of the spirit. Then your thinking will be clear. We've reversed the order. With scholasticism, you start with the cognition. You read the scriptures like a recipe to bake a cake, because it's all cognitive, and then you've lost the communion of the spirit. that is designed to change us and reveal much more of who we really are. So that was the early church, and we've kind of lost that emphasis. Not, of course, not completely. People are still human. We have feelings, but we repress them, we deny them, they're contained, and there's a big loss in understanding each other.
I have to say that's, I one of the reasons I started this podcast is I was to do stories of very interesting people. That was the initial driver for me. Well, that's what I thought it was, but it's now come to be more of a like I'm not going to use the word spiritual. I'm more of a pursuit of a higher consciousness, a higher understanding of how this world works, if that makes any sense to you. And so when you talk about what we talked about in private, how the early church, the early Christian, like for instance Saint Augustine and Saint Bernard, it was a much more psychological, much more looking into one's self to, be a better person first, and then the rest follows. Does that make sense?
No, that's a very good summary. It's very much which John Calvin in the Reformation was trying to restore this this understanding of knowing oneself, to know our Maker, to know our Heavenly Father. So because you can't have one without the other. You can't even love our Maker without knowing what you're loving. See, that's a misconception today we have of what love is. That's why I use the term advanced accurate empathy, which comes from actually psychoanalytic psychology. Love is insight into the other person. So you love them accurately, not just sort of this sort of mush that has no direction to it.
Mm. So if you're listening, you're probably wondering why we've gone into Christianity with respect to UFOs, but that's going to become pretty clear because you sent me a video of, I think his name was Jacob Barber. Is that correct? One of these
Jake Barber, yes, interviewed by Ross Coulthart.
Yeah. So if you're a UFO fan, you probably will know who Ross Coulthart is. He's one of these investigative journalists, and he does some pretty good stuff, I have to say. We'll come. Let's just leave it at that for the moment, okay. Kelly. And this disclosure we're getting, this soft disclosure we're getting from governments worldwide, but especially in America, about how they're admitting that the upper echelons of the government, we don't actually know who exactly or why it's being kept secret, or has been kept secret, but we're getting the soft disclosure that non-human intelligence exists and there has been contact, and it's being admitted by governments now, despite thousands upon, if not tens of thousands of accounts, if not hundreds of thousands of accounts of people having encounters with non-human intelligence. And this is a subject I really like, and I got into it just because I thought it was pretty wild and crazy when I first started getting into it. But then when you realize that you're hearing the same thing over and over again, that there seems to be I classify myself as a bit of a pattern thinker. I see things in patterns. That's how I guess I see the world. And this fellow, Jake Barber, was in the crash recovery program. So the crashed UFO retrieval, let's put it that way. I don't know exactly what the term is, but he'd go out in a helicopter, they'd go and retrieve crashed UFOs. And there's that particular video you sent me, what he's talking about. And he was doing this for decades, but he had a very extreme experience. Do you want to talk about that, and then how this will then flow into what we are actually going to talk about?
Well, my comments, of course, I haven't spoken. Well, I have spoken with Ross Coulthart through correspondence, but I've never had any correspondence with Jake Barber. So it's interpretive,
based on the video.
Just because you can say by communion, by shared experiences, that gives the ability to interpret or to anticipate, or if you wish, even to remote view, which is another word du jour that ufologists are using a lot today. So I like the word moral clairvoyance, because that's the elephant in the room that I find so many ufologists are missing. That is happening behind this whole situation. So he shares an experience. You see this hulk of a guy, special forces, tough guy, and he's sharing this emotional experience, which is what I call actually a mystical experience, because I've had one. So, and a mystical experience is a super intense, revealing emotional experience, and that's where my ability to interpret is also supported by communion with other people's experiences, and you can have communion with other people's experiences in Scripture, and so that informs me. It gives me the confidence to say some of the things I'm saying. And I'm not saying it's not a painful journey to get there, because it challenges the deepest depths of our inner being and all of the deep cares that we've had since we've been born in the world. Sorry, I get a little emotional when I talk about these things, but so I can sense his feelings that he's had, that he doesn't know how to process, because I went through that experience. It was so intense, I couldn't cognitively process, but I just knew it was so important, so real, that the words I want to describe were not descriptive words, they were poetic words. It's like all of a sudden I want to become like a poet. I find it poetic words that somehow describe the beauty that you can't process. And so when I see him sharing that experience, I also know from experience how immediately after having that experience, you can be tempted. There are forces that stop you from going there. And what I found interesting in his experience is he had such a violent reaction on his physical body, that which is a sign that some of these deep experiences, even physically, were not prepared. Now, I'm not 100% sure of the immediate connection, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that there is this kind of reasoning behind it, because things happened even to Moses when he had a burning bush experience. He just his face turned red. I mean, Hollywood shows glory lines with Charlton Heston, after the mountain experience, but it's still, Scripture says no one can see the Lord or God face to face and live, because it just kill us. Basically, we can't. So in the Moses case, he had to see the backside because it would be too powerful. So you see all these shared experiences that helps you develop that kind of moral clairvoyance of what might be going on. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that I keep saying is the elephant in the room that we're not seeing, that I felt is so pulled to talk about this after all these years, because really, I didn't even want to write my book, because I had to go back into all these early experiences that were painful in my family experience, because when we're born in the world, we have this sensitivity before we speak, so it's hard to explain these things, but I'm doing my best to get it across to you.
I understand. Well, maybe I should explain what. So this Jake Barber fella was coming in on a helicopter to recover, I think it was a classic egg-shaped, one of these things, or a tic-tac shaped UFO that we're talking about, that we see the videos of nowadays. But as they were approaching on the helicopter, he was overwhelmed by the sense of, it wasn't joy, I think it was of love or joy, but he was discussing this just amazing feeling of peace, love, and joy. And they went down, picked it up, took it back, but there was an overwhelming, tears.
Yes.
That what the heck is, what, it must have been a huge surprise. But he also nearly died from the experience, because he had almost like what the symptoms were of radiation sickness. Like he got very, very badly burnt. And so, when you talk about that, and you talk about what we've heard about Moses on Mount Sinai coming down with the burnt face, it's there's a lot of stories, and this is what I found very fascinating, is because what we talked about before, there is actually a lot of stories in the Bible about what would sound to modern ears like a non-human intelligence experience, an alien experience.
Yeah. So what's your question?
Question basically is, well, I mean, can you give us some examples from? So my point basically is, what this has been happening for thousands of years. These
Yes.
experiences have been happening for thousands of
Yes.
years, and probably thousands of years before that, because we see some weird things from the Sumerians, and they call them the Anunnaki. They have all these different descriptions for different, depends on which part of the world you're in, but going back a long, long, long time. So what I'm trying to figure out is, well, actually, give us some examples. Let's use the Bible, because that's a book that most people have in their house and they can go check out for themselves, where there has been an experience, what would be classified now as like an experience with a non-human intelligence.
So you're asking me to quote a non-human
No, just
intelligence?
because some of the stories that we've had from the Bible, which would accurately describe what's been happening lately. And if not, then we can always come back
Yeah.
to it. It's no
Yeah.
problem.
No. Yeah. Well, you're asking some deep, profound questions that take some contemplative
Yeah,
reflection or prayer,
yeah,
which requires entering into communion with the whole subject again.
yeah. Okay,
Which,
no,
yeah, yeah,
all right. Well, that's okay. We can come back to that. I mean,
yeah,
let it cook
yeah.
away in your subconscious, and we can
Okay.
come back to the one. But again, going back to it. So if I'm how I understand what we were talking about before is that we are in the process of having this disclosure, and one of the things that what we hear from the disclosure, is that humans, we are not ready for full disclosure. And people will say things like, "Oh, come on, just tell us, it's get it out in the open, and then let's see what happens." But what you were saying is, it's not that we're not necessarily mentally capable of understanding of this information, but it's also could be a physical danger.
Well, the physical danger is the consequences of not basically wanting to be ready. Because we have conflicting motivations. I mean, scriptures talks about they're at war with each other, that are preventing us from really finding out who we are. And what prevents us from finding out who we really are prevents us from finding our maker. The two work together. And so that's what, of course, was a theme of the Reformation. Excuse me. So, um, psychology, secular psychology, has done a lot of work to understand human pathology and psychopathology, and a lot of work's been done, but they just look at the external phenomena. They don't take it to the next level of what's actually going on, in the inner being of human consciousness. So that's where I go further. I try to integrate that in a more, I hesitate to use this word, but in a more holistic word, but it's a word I find often very abused, but because we're not talking about the same thing.
Yeah, no, carry on. I
Okay.
want to hear it. Yeah.
So, yeah, well, as I pursued my research, I found, again, more shared experiences, particularly with St. Augustine and St. Bernard, because there's a reason why they're the most influential saints. There's a reason why St. Bernard and Augustine influenced John Calvin, although John Calvin had his biases, like we all have to, but that tried to return Western culture to its orthodox understanding. And he was a lawyer, John Calvin, and not a psychologist. And so it had some of its shortcomings. And so eventually, with scholasticism, when things become so cognitive that we lost basically the early Christian psychology, which deals with this unconscious becoming conscious that we're preventing from happening. So you get people like Freud who appear to fill the void, you know, and of course he feels it totally inadequately in many ways, but not in other ways. I mean, there is an unconscious becoming conscious, and that he focused on that. He got the motivations wrong. He talked that the fundamental motivation of human nature is the narcissistic motivation, and the super ego that's containing the beast in us and all of that. And uh, then there's the neo-Freudians that came after him, from the middle school of object relations theory, who talk, no, from clinical observation, we see there's something. They wouldn't use these words because that's risk of going fringe, so they had to be careful with the words they use. But they called it primary love is primary, and the narcissistic motivation is a secondary response to the loss of primary love in human nature. And of course, in the early Christian understanding, you get God's definition of who God is. He's love, But, we don't understand what love is. We can't really understand what love really is without understanding the author of what love is. So, see, it brings us back to this understanding. We have to understand our maker to understand what love is and who we are. So we have this kind of vicious circle that we're struggling with, either by misinterpreting our motivations or by getting seduced by our motivation. Hence, you get the Lord's Prayer says, "Keep me, preserve me from temptation." Which is the one prayer Jesus gives, which is foundational to our development. So you begin to see that all his parables and the imagery that he's using is a form of controlled disclosure, because we've built fallen identities, false images of ourselves. And so, how do you reduce our ontological shock? You come back indirectly, so to minimize that ontological shock. And so that brings me right back to Colonel Clarnell, which I came out on a video with, uh, to who's doing this kind of controlled disclosure, and he's making all these Judeo-Christian connections, which he says he's a Christian himself, uh, connecting these dots in a very, very subtle way. Of course, and he's doing this is right in my background. As a theoanthropologist, a theopsychologist, I see exactly, at least for me, what I'm seeing. He's implying, whether he's fully conscious of it or not. I doesn't hardly even know. Even to say, "Oh, no, I didn't mean that." No, you said it. It's on record. This is what you said. We need to devote ourselves to our faith traditions as the resolution to ontological shock. I mean, that's the subject of his theme. So whether he likes what I said or not, the words are there, so I can bring them to their logical conclusion.
Can you define what ontological shock is for those who might not, like myself, know exactly what you're talking about?
Well, it's our view of the nature of reality and who we are as a person, individually, personally, and the way we've grown up to view things. I mean, that's a explanation in the vernacular kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so ontological shock is the difference between those views, for to be easy to understand, between reality. And to make the leap from reality is not an easy process when who we think we are is supporting all these narcissistic motivations that we have in our human natures that gives us comfort and that have reduced our anxiety. They're, like I use the term, anxiety containing identities. So when you've invested yourself in this anxiety containing identity since birth, as the world has inaccurately reflected who we are, and sometimes accurately, I'm not putting everything, life is gray, it's not black and white. But to make the leap to change our inner selves is the degree of ontological shock that can happen. And we should have enough experience with extreme kind of narcissistic people when they're confronted with reality that challenges them, that they don't react very well. And that's why I quote the story of Cain and Abel, because this is not new. Just like Colonel Nell says, this is not new. We've been visiting. I mean, for whoever's paying attention, that shoe's already dropped. He says the government, Pentagon has admitted they're not ours, they're not the Chinese. But there's a lot of shoes that have already dropped, and we're not paying attention.
Hmm.
And because we don't want to pay attention, partially too.
But that makes sense to me. So I'm trying to process this in my own head as we speak. So you mentioned before there are these entities, these non-human intelligences, these not aliens. I don't want to use that term. It's a bit too popular. It's a bit too overused now. But you mentioned how there is a battle in I don't know, somewhere else in this realm between the entities which want us to find out who us as human beings actually are, and the others who are trying to block that. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you're referring, it depends which language you want me to use. I can go into psychoanalytic language, or I can go into biblical, scriptural language.
Well, just in general, because just generally, because it's it's like it's like one of these stories that we get in movies all the time. It's this battle between good and bad. Now, is it something to do with that? Is there a reason why some of these entities would try to stop us knowing who we are?
Well, there's been revelations in our Western history or Judeo-Christian history of what those battles are. And, we're very arrogant today, because we build things that they didn't build in the past. But, so we have a narrow vision in certain areas. And so what the past has told us is just, it's not remote viewing. It's, a lot of fantasy or subjective or circumstantial uh, evidence or something, but not really something to spend too much time about. Well, no, if Colonel Nell quotes Jaime Shed as data and Elizondo as data, you can quote the prophets as data. Okay, so they felt so important of their experiences that they had to write it down, and it's still around. And so the test of time is a much better support of data for me than some of the flings you're seeing in the ufology movement. I think this and I think that, and they have no substance, really historical substance behind them. So these experiences have gone on for a long time, and so I take into account what they've said, that there are fallen angels, and that there's a narrative behind that they've somehow seen this situation long before what we're seeing today. And so that gives them some depth to understanding what is taking place. And it's helpful because now we use the term interdimensional beings. Okay. So Jacques Vallée likes that. They're all interdimensional beings. They're not coming in from planets,
Yeah,
as if he knows. Okay. But,
exactly.
you know, uh, so we have to deal with these kind of interpretations, but they're also helpful because language is helpful for us to communicate. So interdimensional beings is perhaps more accessible to understand the phenomena of fallen angels. And so it implies some are not benevolent. And Jacques Vallée would agree. He's concerned about those kind of influences, but he's cloaking himself behind being scientific and looking for patterns and things like that, and on the outside. So we never know really what's his personal belief. It's always supported by the scientific paradigm, and to make it everything like kosher, how we accept things, because we don't like to go into these areas where they get too personal.
Mm. Yeah, it's all very fascinating. So when you mentioned before, you said the early. So if I first off, I'll just say, it's referred to as fallen angels. That's using the language of the time, because people are going to go, oh, here we go, that they're angels. We're talking about, it's all goes back to religion and things like that, which I don't think we are talking about that at all. I think that's possibly the language that was used at the time, which we still use today. But the crossover between what we're saying now, what we're hearing now, matches quite pretty accurately as to what people were talking about thousands of years ago. And when you mentioned, when we talked about this yesterday, is the early Christian church was about self-development as opposed to going to church and being told what to do. It was actually more about yourself, working on yourself. And you mentioned before about cleaning the inside of the cup, and the outside of the cup becomes clean. And that, I find that very interesting as well, because, like I said, that's how I'm starting to see things in my own way. But when you talk about this, so this Colonel Nell, who's got very, very high clearance, security clearance, as high as you can probably, as that we know that such clearance exists. And when he starts talking in, shall we say, Christian terms about what's happening, it seems to me that what he's saying, and what you've been saying as well, is that there's a need for us as humans, if we want to understand who we are and why we're here. More importantly, is what is this all about? What is this our life on this planet or this realm all about? And whether it's we have to get back to that. We have to cleanse is not the right word, but we have to be better people before we can learn who exactly we are. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I understand what you're
badly.
trying to say.
I said it badly, but it's difficult subject. It's a difficult way to bring it about. And I also just want to add, and then I'll let you talk about it. Is a lot of this, like I said at the start about the podcast, is become what I'm figuring out by speaking to all these different people, is that there is a journey that people undergo in their lives, and it usually involves hardship. Almost always involves very dark times in which one needs to reevaluate what your views on the world are, and excuse me, and improve yourself in order to get to the next stage of your life, like a higher level of your life. And I mean, take that from whatever way you want it, how you want to say a higher level of your life. But it's one, people need to experience the darkness to go to the light, if that makes any sense. That makes sense, surely.
That's an important analogy that you just gave. We wouldn't feel emotional pain if we didn't know its opposite. Even our physical bodies, I have a pain in my liver region, it's telling me something's wrong there. So we have innate abilities that we have been endowed with. We have a conscience. We have a free will, limited. Some of us would like to live forever, but it doesn't happen, so it's limited. But we do have free will. And the rules of love is you don't impose on someone to love, and you don't interfere in their ability to make choices. And that's what I tried to bring about in my video that I just recently released on Colonel Nell. Is he talks about there's conservation laws in the universe, and they're homogeneous. And so some of the things we do on this planet, are likely standard throughout the universe. So this developmental aspect of who we are, he's basically saying that it's homogeneous. So, and then he talks about, in order to survive as a species, we have to attain a certain threshold to survive. And so for non-human intelligence to be able to travel throughout the universe without self-destroying themselves like we've been doing with all our civilizations, and you have to reach a certain level of development, personal development, where you reach the term is a homeostasis in the ecosystem. He uses Nell uses Carl uses the term, I forget what he uses. Economy. Okay, but we're talking about basically the same thing. So, um, in order to survive, to get to that next level, and so the words he chooses, a conserved quantity, you know, he's it's strikingly close to the conserved quantity. We've been living through our whole history of our scriptures. It's all there, you know, informing us through a form of controlled disclosure of the consequences of our choices. So I'm suggesting pay attention. If you've got a pain in your liver region, take care of it. So when you have emotional pain, there's hope in it. And I suffered a lot emotionally, a lot. And for some grace, I received inner strength to persevere because of something deeper behind the emotional pain that I was longing for to be connected as a child. And this is not unique to me. If we seek access to those deepest feelings in our inner being, we can grow in wisdom. I mean, these things are not new, what I'm saying. I've found a lot of translating words in our modern technical jargon that we have today compared to, church fathers in those days, but they're describing the same phenomena.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've lost the correlations, the vision of the correlations with the phenomena. And that's, again, for me, the elephant in the room that I keep trying to bring in the room for the ufologists that are fascinated with remote viewing. Wow, but no, it's there's so much more. There's a much more holistic remote viewing, which I try to bring in as a term of moral clairvoyance, that this is all about. It's not the magic, basically, what I'm talking about.
Well, it's I'm the same. I think almost everyone. I mean, when you hear now, there's the big chat about people. I have anxiety. I'm anxious about this. I have no purpose in my life. I've lost all. I don't have a meaning in my life. I feel like I'm on a treadmill. I was actually discussing this with a friend yesterday, and, because we were talking about something similar, but not what we're talking about now. This inner angst, I think, is a good way of putting it. Is that we don't know what we don't know, which is causing us the angst, is what is the whole purpose? What are we here for? And to people who are listening, this is going to sound quite outlandish, but your friend, not your friend, your this Colonel Carl Nell. I mean, he was in front of Congress testifying to this stuff. You can watch on. It's a good video to watch. And
it was actually David Grush.
David Grush was in Congress. Yes.
Yeah. He was testifying, but Colonel Nell was his boss. He led the UAP task force. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it's getting back into it. But is it that, Kelly? Is it that simple? Are these non-human intelligences, these aliens, whatever you want to call them, are they trying to get humanity, us, you and me, and everyone else, to get to a higher level of consciousness and get out of our ego-driven, narcissistic ways and start, living life as it should be? Big question.
So let's switch. We can go back and forth between benevolent angels versus malevolent fallen. Let's say you have benevolent non-human intelligence. Benevolent would be defined by someone who's very caring about our own development, but while respecting, with a huge moral compass, that respects our free choice to choose how we want to evolve for our species. So it's reasonable to assume that there would be times of compassion, of some kind of interference. Maybe interference is the wrong word, but intervention is more accurate, where they intervene out of compassion, certain things. And of course, this might explain so many of these experiences that we've had in our history. And of course, someone intervened with me, and it took me a while to recognize, uh, and basically through a lot of pain, it took me a while to feel that I was very loved, by someone far greater than myself, and to have that sink in. Because I grew up in a family environment where, in psych terms, it's called a negative introject. Because in a narcissistic environment, you speak of truthful moral issues and you get clobbered, and so you want to stay connected. So after a while, you start believing it. Well, maybe there is something bad about me. Let's call them a negative introject of other people's projections that they can't handle. So these are developmental issues I had to go through, but they're not unique to me. Other people can be going through these type of struggles. That's why I felt so compelled. I need to speak up, because I've been private all my life and just out of the public view. But I felt I have to come out. And I struggled. If I don't, I mean, there could be some mercenary motivations. I felt, I don't want to be the one in the parable of the talent in scriptures who buries his talent under the ground and just plays it safe. And I'm not going to talk about these things. Just keep living my own life. No, 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 no. I've got to do this. And I think Colonel Nell triggered this motivation in me. I've got to speak out. So I stopped my book writing for the moment, and I wanted to get this out. But then I had to bring myself up to date. What's going on in this UFO community? Because I had put it on the back burner for quite a while. Because you don't need to see a UFO to develop inwardly. Okay, a lot of people don't seem to get this. So what? So you have some remote viewing because you saw something on a mountaintop. Who cares? I mean, there's so much repetition about the phenomena, but they don't make the correlations with the phenomena.
Yeah. So just because you have seen a UFO doesn't mean to say, well, you're not taking it. What's the message? The message is, wow, I have seen a UFO. Aren't I special? Or you don't have to see that. You basically, you just mentioned something which I've been again talking a lot about recently, is about intuition. And I've spoken on here before about how I've been compelled in my life by, I mean, it's an inner force, but who knows where it's come from. But I'm absolutely compelled to do something, and there's no real other way of describing it is an intuition. There's a voice in my head saying, you must do this. This is part of your development, I guess you would say. This is part of your curriculum in life, that you have to do this. I'm being nudged. There's an intervention going on to get me out of something I'm doing, which wasn't making me happy, to go and do something different. And yeah, there's it's wouldn't it be crazy, Kelly, if all this disclosure that we're getting, which it seems to be now, based on what you're saying, based on this what this Colonel Nell was talking about, is about humans improving themselves, not through religion, not through aliens or non-human intelligences, but by making themselves better in the first place.
Well, no, he actually does say to focus on our faith traditions with devotion.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe you're using religion in the pejorative sense because of bad experiences.
No,
Because
no, no.
you just
I meant it in. Yeah, maybe it did sound a bit pejorative. Didn't mean to. Anyway,
okay,
carry on.
okay. Oh, well, what would you like me to carry on
No,
with?
so what he's saying is, based on all this disclosure, if I can dilute it into how I'm
Yes.
comprehending what we're talking
Yeah.
about now,
Yeah. Yeah.
is that this disclosure we're getting from the government, from very, very senior people in government, saying, yes, we've had these. This is a real thing. We have contact with non-human intelligences. They don't really describe what they are, but they're saying, you're not, we, us, human race, isn't, the majority are not ready for these disclosures. And what he's saying is, using faith-based teachings such as, I don't know, I'm absolutely not a scholar of religion,
Yeah. No, I
but
understand.
let's say adherence to, for example, the Ten Commandments. Let's, as an example of as a way to live a better life.
You used a very important word. You said adherence. And there's a French translation of scriptures, where instead of using the term faith, it was translated by a Jewish rabbi, actually. And he translated the proper words as it would be stated in Hebrew. When we have the English word faith, he talked as faith as adherence, l'adhérence in French. You cling to, you abide. So there's a communion that starts to take place when you enter into those experiences that are narrated in the scriptures, and you cling to them, and that changes us over time. So that I just wanted to bring that word
Mm.
out that you just used, to adhere. It's a key. It is a key word. So you see how intuition, when we discuss, brings these things out. So we have this capacity to get there if we're willing. So Colonel Nell's control disclosure is directed towards the willing,
Mm.
because you're not going to reach the unwilling. They're going to stay in their box and not want to go out. And that's the danger with full disclosure. What's going to happen? How do you manage the aggressiveness or the beast, which Freud talks about, that the superego has to contain in human nature? How do you manage that? And, governments, as Colonel Nell says, are designed to protect the nation from foreign and domestic threats. And so that's a threat. I mean, and it's not a new threat. It starts with Cain and Abel, trying to help us understand these dynamics, these relational dynamics.
It's so fascinating. The whole thing is, from my point of view, like I say, I'm not. I like, I will read stories about UFOs. I like to read the abductee or contactee. The abductee ones are usually quite awful, really. People getting probed and experimented on and that sort of thing. The other, with the contactees, there are some negative and some very, very positive ones. The people come back and say they were given information, and what I would like to, before I even started getting into this subject, I would have laughed at me talking about this stuff, seriously. But when you go into it and you start realizing that there are so many stories about this, and I'm going to reiterate that, and it's not just in the last 50 years since World War II, since the nuclear bomb. It's been going on for a long, long, long time. There are medieval stories of people having experiences and supernatural, non-human intelligence experiences. So it's not a new thing, and it is happening, and it's just so interesting that the world is a lot more mysterious and incomprehensible than what we could ever know. And that is, for me, is part of it, is because I feel inside me that there's a lot more to know. But for me, the problem is, what I'm struggling with is actually how to access that knowledge. Where do I find it? And I'm not finding it in books. People I've spoken to have said, and it's very annoying when they say this, but you have to go inside yourself to gain this understanding and knowledge. And I say, yeah, but where do I look inside myself? And he said, well, just try it and just keep trying and you'll get something.
Yeah.
And that's very frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's very, so I talk to all these different people, yourself, all these people on the podcast saying the same thing. And it's like, but give me a roadmap. Just give me a roadmap, or give me a sign. And, then I'll get a sign. And I think, this is all too weird. And it's almost too simple. I think that for our modern minds now is this the answer? Is that the answer? What we're doing? It just seems like such a simple answer.
Well, we do have a roadmap, and that roadmap is in our personal experiences since we were born into the world. So the father of the diagnostic categories of mental illness is one of them is Otto Kernberg, and he, from a totally secular point of view and clinical observation, he developed his diagnostic categories of mental illness on a continuum of intensity of the narcissistic motivation, or in the biblical terms, language of the same phenomena, the lust of the flesh. It's called the lust of the flesh. It's based on that intensity level, you would get external behavioral manifestations that would define the diagnosis of the type of mental illness that you have. It was obsessive compulsive, schizophrenic, paranoid, schizophrenic, histrionic. You get these different diagnostic categories. So coming back to the roadmap, well, I saw him in a conference in Geneva, actually, Otto Kernberg, and he talks about. I asked him specific questions. This is many years ago when I was searching. He talks about what kind of defines who we are in these issues is peak experiences. So just from an emotional phenomena, and there are certain experiences that we have emotionally during our developmental phase of who we are that are filled with meaning. And so when we watch a movie, for example, you started with movies and things like that. If we have some emotional sensitivity left to us, we get moved to tears. Something we see in the scene, we've projected ourselves in the scene, forgotten our conscious control, our narcissistic control, and we somehow immersed, and something happened to us that moved something inward of us to cry. And then, so that was a very moving film. Maybe turn the television off and move on with our superficial lives and don't think about it. Well, no, it's the opposite. Those tears had much to say about what was really important to us at that moment. And that's why I try to talk about those little emotional experiences as minute little mystical experiences that had meaning, but that we didn't pay attention to. And so there are roadmaps in our personal histories that can inform us of what's important to us and what we're really seeking, is the point I'm trying to make. I don't know. Is that clear enough?
Yeah. No,
okay.
For sure. It's for me nowadays, and I used to watch horror films and things when I was younger. And now anything, especially if it's got to do with kids being harmed, killed, tortured, all that kind of stuff, I can't watch it nowadays. I just simply cannot watch it. I find it since having children, it's too difficult to watch. I just don't want to see, or anything that's overly sad. Sometimes you get these Oscar-winning movies, these movie of the year, and it's just heartbreak after heartbreak, and I can't deal with that. I just don't want that in my life. I want to have largely positive experiences. I know it all balances out for sure, but I don't really want to voluntarily subject myself to be sad and start crying. However, there's nothing like watching a film and you, especially as an ex-military guy, bursting into tears watching a film, and it's the thing you least expect. So I guess looking back, and it's usually because of someone's you know what I mean. I unconsciously burst into tears at probably the silliest things. So I guess that's what happened to you as well.
Well, our journeys are unique to each of us, so, but there are things we share in common at the same time. So that's what makes life really interesting, and we help each other grow, and paying attention to these types of conversations, I think, helps growth. I was always surprised in Italy, how, because they're so communicative with their emotions. Of course, it's quite Mediterranean to be that way too. It's quite Jewish, Israeli, and it's that to be in touch with their emotions. But it helps us educate ourselves. So you get all people of all walks of life who educate each other outside of the university just through conversations, in the streets. You could go to Italy, they're talking in the street and talking about geopolitics and psychology or whatever. And people educate each other that way, just through communication like that, sharing feelings, which sometimes in Anglo-Saxon cultures, we're more distant, and we we tend to put things in little boxes a little bit more, and really rely on the scientific paradigm, which is important. No one's disputing that, but there's a whole other realm, which that's why I quote Max Planck, who says matter is derivative of consciousness. And he makes these statements long ago, that are filled with insight.
Mm. That's like quantum computing, isn't it?
Well, quantum theory, and
Quantum
the
theory, yeah.
whole drive in that direction of physics that now today are basically proven. That
Yeah, and that's a that's a topic for another podcast. But so time wise, we're getting on. But what do you think the actual UFOs themselves, these craft? What do you think these are then? Do you have a view on that?
well, I've felt that I haven't had to focus on the subject after my experience in Sicily, 4 years, with people all over the world coming every day, meeting this person, sharing, and of course I was involved in the process. And I loved him like a father, but unfortunately I saw the decline through his temptations, where he just went off the rocker, and I felt I had to expose him and had him arrested on moral grounds, again because I had this moral compass that I have ever since a child, and I had some kind of inner strength. And at that time, I don't care, because I knew he'd experienced something, and so he used that aura of experience to manipulate when he declined, and his narcissistic motivations took over and became abusive. And so I when it got out of hand, I had to stop him, because he was manipulating innocent young people searching, you know, with that holy desire to find their maker, to find who they are, and would use those things to self-aggrandize himself. I was, in my mid 20s, young guy, you know, and he was an experienced man. And I said, I've got to expose this. And I laid out my case, how he's receiving messages and how he used it to manipulate. And he was arrested, thrown in jail, and the court case went on. And there were legal issues for which it fizzled out, but he was still thrown in prison on a lot of evidence for 3 months, and got, you know, they don't have bail in Italy, but it's called libertà provvisoria. It's a temporary freedom until the case is ruled upon, which fizzled out because there was only two Italian court cases in its history that were succeeded to prove mind manipulation. And they call it plagio in Italian, and they removed it from the acts because the state has to fund all these costs, and it just didn't make any sense. So that's why he got off the hook. It wasn't he wasn't absolved from the proofs that I brought to the court system, because it was going to be the third case, according to my lawyer, the third case that we were going to win against this particular crime, which applied to fraud and to rape of my then wife, a marriage he had arranged when I was 20 years old. So that'll all come out in the book. But what it tells me, I mean, I walked away from that whole subject for years because I didn't need to grow in knowing myself and who I am and my maker by focusing on the UFO subject. So it's only recently that it brought me back into all of this, because I had subsequent many experiences after that informed me that didn't have to be related to UFOs. So I feel I can come in with perhaps a little bit more objectivity than some of all the fascination with the phenomena, that they're so obsessive about the phenomena that you don't see the peripheral correlations that are tied to it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? We could be done with some intervention right about now, I would suggest, in the next couple of years. And I mean, it would be quite nice if somebody came down and knocked some people's heads together and sorted out what's going on. But maybe this is all part of it. But on the geopolitical stage. And I wish it could be avoided. But so Kelly, if you want to just sum up your views on things, and then we'll leave it at that. How about that?
Yeah, that's fine. Oh,
all right.
What do you want me to sum up?
I would like you to sum up your view. Just what's the, in a nutshell, what we need to do. What's the goal?
That's a big responsibility you're placing on my shoulders there.
Well,
no, I mean, to find ourselves is much, much closer than we think it is, and there's hope if you want to go on this journey. But don't be surprised if you get in touch with some painful moments. There is hope. So actually, the Apostle Paul talks about faith as hope for that which is unseen, but you can see through the things that are made where it's leading to. So there are answers in scriptures that can give us the answers we need, and that's, again, I'll close it on that is what Colonel Nell is recommending, that we focus on our faith traditions with devotion. So that's how I'd sum it up.
All right. Well, Kelly, I know there's an awful lot that we've had to skip over in this one, but we only had an hour and a bit for this. But I'm very keen to do this again. We can talk about some more stuff as the disclosure maybe gathers steam, hopefully, and find out what's going on. But I just want to thank you very much. And we've had some really good conversations over the last few months. And I would just like to reiterate the fact that I appreciate all your research and all your knowledge on this subject. And it's just such an interesting take on what's going on. And it fits in quite nicely what I end up talking a lot about on this podcast. For whatever reason, it seems to jibe. We got introduced, and yet again, the right person at the right time comes along. You really can't make this up, can you? It's almost like there's some, non-human intelligence getting involved.
Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I'm available whenever you want. I'm happy to talk about this.
Perfect. But that's great. Thank you so much, Kelly, and thanks very much for listening.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.
You can stay.